Hello, I'm Katherine French of the University of Michigan. I'm starting a new book project about a medieval London boarding house. Living in a single room in a boarding house or as a lodger in another household was both a recognized part of the urban life cycle and a sign of low status. For upwardly mobile young men and women, it was part of the life cycle of advancement and ambition that ideally ended with marriage, a move to a multi-roomed house with a workshop, and affiliation with a company or guild. Living in a single room was also often the first stop for immigrants newly arrived to the city. But when single room occupancies lasted beyond marriage, when marriage never came, or when marriage ended, they were then a sign of and a reason for limited economic and social opportunities. In these cases, single rooms defined occupants as low status, men who had no workshop and women who had no house or servants to supervise. Individuals and households living in single rooms stood in stark contrast to the legitimacy and primacy that medieval moralists and civic authorities gave to patriarchal households connected to a merchant or trade guild. This ideology coincided with the increase in association of houses as places of retreat, display, and social identity. In effect, they had become homes. In part, this was a consequence of improving house construction, changes in property law, and the increase in wages and consumption after the plague, when survivors and descendants spent more money on home furnishings and better food. Not only did they seek color and comfort, but those with resources also sought to separate out their workspaces from where they slept and ate. So the question I hope to answer with this paper is, could Londoners living in a single room create homes? Looking at 17th century Roman inventories, Renato Ago showed that middling and poor women filled their rooms with cheap furnishings, including art they could sell when times got tough, while men furnished their lodgings with fewer items that cost more. Men could sell their furnishings if necessary, but they also generally had more economic opportunities than women. An unstated but implied part of Ago's argument is that until times got difficult, women interacted with their heavily furnished and decorated dwellings differently than men. And in trying to secure an uncertain future, they created homes, rooms adorned in ways that pleased and comforted them. Using rental information from a medieval London boarding house, I hope to show something of how the housing priorities and concerns of Londoners living in similar circumstances of consumption and modest means. I argue that stability and room choice reveal something of what home meant to Londoners living in single rooms. The boarding house I'm interested in was located between Wood Street and Gutter Lane, close to Cheapside. Lying in the parish of St. Peter's Westcheap, it was near the heart of medieval London's commercial district, not far from Goldsmiths Row. Attached to the house was a brew house called Cross Keys, several shops, and a cellar. In 1345, the owner, John Shoreditch, a knight and diplomat in the retinues of Edward II and III, left the house to Westminster Abbey. After a few years of indecision, probably due to a combination of the Black Death and Widow Shoreditch still using the place, the Abbey renovated the property, converting it into a boarding house. Administratively, the Abbey referred to the whole complex as Shoreditch Rents. While some of the tenants in Shoreditch Rents were young, ambitious journeymen waiting to move up in their companies, most were not. By and large, the residents were young and old, single men and women supporting themselves at piecework or working in the service industry, and thus on the edges of merchant and artisan companies with little opportunity for advancement. There were also widows downsizing after the deaths of their husbands, immigrants from across the British Isles and the continent, and the middling and working poor, some of whom moved out of the house ahead of the rent collector. And I should add that these categories are not mutually exclusive. I have the name of 234 tenants, 175 men and 59 women. And they lived in Shoreditch Rents between 1410 and 1520. Tenants affiliated with a company occasionally appear in company records, and a few appear in parish records. But most of what I know about these people comes from the rental information, which consists of names, occasionally occupation, the room they rented, its cost, and the duration of their tenancy. During Shoreditch's life, the house was an open hall house. And here we have a schema, a cutaway schema that shows you what a hall house might look like. The abbey constructed new rooms by filling in the hall and remodeling service rooms, giving it between 8 and 9 rooms and 4 garrets, in addition to the brew house, shops, and cellar. The rental only vaguely describes the layout. Some years the monks provide descriptions such as the main room above the rooms and the chamber over the stairs. In other years, they numbered the rooms 1 through 8 or 9, with room 6 and 7 next to each other, and room 9 appearing and disappearing over the years in a confusing fashion. One possible interpretation of the layout is that there was a cellar with a storeroom and kitchen above it, and that face on Wood Street. Above that were rooms 1 and 2. In the old Hall House, there were 3 rooms on the ground floor, and then 3 or 4 more rooms above it. And then finally, there were 4 garrets in the attic, 2 facing Wood Street and 2 facing Gutter Lane. Among the amenities were 2 hearths, apparently in fireplaces because there were 2 chimneys. There was a well, a latrine, there were plastered walls, a roof covered with tiles from Flanders, windows with latches, and doors with locks. The different amounts the abbey charged for rooms means that some were more desirable than others. Access, light, size, and proximity to the amenities determined which rooms were the most or least desirable. Pricing suggests that those facing Wood Street were preferred to those facing Gutter Lane, which may have overlooked the latrines and received the smoke from the kitchen or the brew house. Street-facing property throughout London generally rented for more than property opening into the alleyways. Evidence from other houses also suggests that residents preferred rooms on the first floor to those on the ground floor, where the shops were and access by intruders was easy. Garrets, to be sure, were harder to access, potentially providing more security, but they had less headroom and were darker and smaller. If tenants used a brazier or chafing dish to heat food and warm the room, then they were also smoky. They were by far the cheapest room in the house and had the highest vacancy rates, showing their lack of desirability. Even though the garrets were all priced the same, Joan Keeper moved from one on the western side of the house to one facing Wood Street when she had a chance. The 2 most expensive rooms were room 4 and 6, leased for 160 pence. The abbey called room 6 the main room or principal room. Rooms 1, 2, 8, and 9 all rented for 96 pence, and the garrets for 16 pence. In the late 15th century, rents declined, but the hierarchy of the rooms remained largely intact, with room 4 remaining the most expensive room in the house, declining from 160 pence to 96 pence. Room 6 lost the most value, declining from its peak of 160 pence to 60 pence in 1487, but rising to 72 pence by 1520. The differential decline in the rents of room 4 and 6 suggests meaningful differences between them. It may be that room 6 had been Shoreditch's private chamber, so that it was larger or grander than the ones created by the abbey's renovations. In some years, room 6 even had its own kitchen. In contrast, the rent for the garrets rose from 16 pence to 24 pence, an increase that may reflect increased demand for cheap lodgings or the desire to price some people out of the house. Stability and choice of room, therefore, offer evidence not only of economic precarity, but attitudes and preferences for housing, qualities that made a dwelling a home. While only a quarter of the tenants were women, they had on average longer tenancies than men, just under 5 years, compared to men who on average stayed for a little bit more than 3. Women's longer tenancies are further reflected in the fact that 4 of the 5 longest residents were women. Yet while the women stayed longer, they also generally lived in the cheaper rooms. On average, women paid 81 pence a year in rent, compared to men who paid on average 91 pence a year. And women rented the garrets at slightly higher rates than men. To be sure, these differences reflected single women's more constricted social and economic opportunities. They could not be full members of guilds, even if they had training, and London rulers looked upon them as morally suspicious because of their lack of male supervision. But like the Roman women discussed by Ago, the women at Shoreditch Rents were interacting with both their rooms and the building in different ways than men because they were staying longer. While we cannot see how the women furnished their rooms, we can see their stability and longevity as an investment in their rooms. And with this investment came familiarity and a way of understanding how their rooms became a home. Once a tenant moved into shortage rents, they typically stayed put. But of the 200 plus tenants, 47 moved within the house. Most moved only once, but 12 moved twice, and 2 moved 3 times. Again, gender is a factor, with a greater percentage of women moving within the house than men, 43% of the women compared to 26% of the men. And just over half the tenants who moved within the house moved to cheaper rooms. The relationship between economizing and stability was not uniform. In 1480, after her father died, Joan Ufford moved into room 4 with her mother. Her mother died in 1486, and Joan stayed in room 4 for a year and a half, and then moved into the 4th garret, which was in the back of the house and cost a fifth of the rent. Her move shows a serious financial reversal, and indeed she disappears from the rental a year and a half later. Her move to a cheaper room ended her stability. Other tenants had similar trajectories, but there were other calculations behind the decision to move to a lesser room. Arnold Miles, a tailor from the Low Countries, initially took whatever room was available to him. With a foothold in the house, he moved to cheaper rooms shortly thereafter. Miles lived in the cheaper room until his death in 1441, 8 years later. For him and other immigrants, the move to cheaper rooms allowed them to achieve stability. While most movement within the house was to less expensive rooms, 49% moved to a better room, expanded into a second place, or made a lateral move. The 9 men who improved their housing had on average a tenancy of nearly 10 years, giving them much more stability than the rest of the men who lived in the house. Some had professional aspirations and used movement to a better room as part of their strategy for achieving them. Shortly after finishing his apprenticeship as a goldsmith, John Leggett moved into room 9 and then a year later moved into room 6, increasing his rent from 8 shillings a year to 12. Room 6 was the most expensive and possibly visibly better room than the other rooms. His move meant he was using his house as a display of his identity, much like guildmasters would with multi-roomed houses. He stayed in room 6 for 2 years and then moved to his own house and goldsmith shop and took on an apprentice. His move within shortage rents shows confidence in his prospects. Women also moved to better rooms, and like the men, those who did had a longer average tenancy than the women in the house as a whole, a tenancy of just over 9 years. Half of these women were widows, and the other half probably not yet or never married women. Joan Nailcaster, one of the house's longer serving tenants, was probably a never married woman. Nailcaster moved into room 3 in 1416, and 8 years later upgraded to room 3, which increased her rent by 1 shilling 8 pence, and probably moved her off the ground floor. She lived there until 1436. Whatever her business, and indeed she could have been a nailcaster, she had the ability and resources which allowed her to move to a room that pleased her more. Nailcaster could afford to move to a room that suited her better, but she did not get to use the house or the room as a launching pad to larger quarters outside of the house. 7 tenants moved laterally. That is, they moved to a different room that cost the same amount. These lateral moves offer further evidence that there were other qualities that made a room desirable, although what exactly motivated these decisions can only be guessed. As with those living in multi-roomed houses, the houses at shortage rents served as manifestations of prosperity or poverty. But the choices tenants made about when they moved within this house show us that decisions about where to live were about more than just economics. Specific qualities about the room came into play, with gender often shaping how tenants understood and interacted with their rooms. Yet even downward moves point to a desire for stability. These choices can be read as an investment in place and an understanding of the building, not just their rooms as home. Alice Dobbins, the longest tenant in the house, shared room 7 with Thomas Dobbins, either her father or her husband, until his death. She remained in that room for another 8 years before moving to one of the western garrets where she lived on her own and where she lived until her own death 10 years later, having lived in the house for 24 years. This progression from room 7 to the garret suggests a diminution of resources. The garret was not only cheaper, it would also have been harder to access, further from sources of food, hotter in the summer and colder in the winter. Even if shortage rents did not help her declining physical capacity, it accommodated her diminishing resources. As the longest tenant in the house, she valued stability and familiarity over ease of access. Lack of opportunity, as understood by civic rulers and medieval moralists, did not preclude those living in a single room from building relationships with both the space or each other and calling where you rested your head home. Thank you.